Have you ever wondered how your absence might profoundly change the lives of everyone around you? Not in the sense of a literal vanishing act, but a conscious step back from the daily demands and interactions that tether you to others? It might strike you as an odd or even unsettling proposition, especially if you're someone who feels deeply responsible for maintaining connections, relationships, or communities. Yet there are moments in life when a quiet, lingering thought surfaces. What if I removed myself from the equation? We aren't talking about packing your bags and heading off to an isolated mountaintop, though some may find that appealing. Instead, imagine choosing to disengage emotionally and mentally. Picture yourself no longer offering immediate responses, no longer being the default listener or empathizer for those around you, and no longer holding yourself in perpetual readiness to soothe, assist, or validate. In a world built around constant connection, group chats, social media, endless availability, choosing distance can feel unsettling, even heretical. You might question yourself, am I selfish or irresponsible for wanting this space? At the core of these questions lies a universal human concern: belonging versus solitude. Most of us have spent our entire lives honing social bonds, learning how to please, how to love, how to adapt, and how to respond to the signals others send us. Stepping away can then feel like a disruption of an unspoken contract. But disruption also carries possibility. If your identity depends on others, what could you discover by stepping away, even briefly? This opening reflection is just the first small step in a much larger and more profound journey. Distance, whether emotional or physical, often exerts an outsized influence on the dynamics between people. When you pull away, or consider pulling away, you start to realize how much of the balance in your relationships hinges on the assumed constancy of your presence. Others anticipate that you will always reply to their messages, always pick up the phone, always be there. When you start introducing a new variable, your absence, that delicate balance wobbles. This shift unsettles both sides. It's like removing a pillar from a structure. It may stand, but it weakens noticeably. People who have grown accustomed to your immediate availability often experience anxiety, confusion, or resentment when it is suddenly withdrawn. And you too might find your own sense of self faltering a bit. After all, who are you when you're no longer upholding the needs or expectations of those around you? We tend to underestimate just how interlaced our emotional energies can be with the people in our lives. Friends, partners, colleagues, and even distant acquaintances develop subtle emotional bargains with us over time. Maybe you are always the listener in a certain friendship, or the caretaker in a family dynamic. Maybe at work, you're the problem solver who's always calm and collected, the person others turn to whenever a crisis arises. Each of these roles we adopt creates a sort of psychic exchange. The question is, what happens if we pause and walk away from these exchanges, even just momentarily? The answer, often, is disruption, an uneasy sense that something fundamental has changed. Curiously, people might not even be able to articulate what bothers them about your pulling back. They only know it triggers their own insecurities, their own unresolved fears, and their own vulnerabilities. The influence of distance, then, is as much about the disruptions it causes within people's psyches as it is about the physical or tangible break from contact. For years, psychologists and philosophers alike have used the metaphor of the mirror to describe how individuals perceive themselves and one another. While we like to imagine that others see us for who we truly are, the reality is far more layered. People often see what they need to see in us, rather than our authentic selves. We become reflections, surfaces onto which they cast their hopes, fears, desires, and insecurities. Consider a friend who leans on you for advice about their career, relationships, or emotional well-being. In this setup, you may be serving as their mirror, reflecting back a sense of capability or reassurance they can't find within themselves. When you step away, you essentially remove the reflective surface they depended upon to define certain aspects of their identity. In many ways, your act of distancing forces them to face their own bare truths without the comforting gloss of your support. This mirror dynamic is not restricted to supportive roles. It manifests in all sorts of complex, even contentious relationships. You might be the co-worker who inadvertently represents success in the eyes of a peer. They measure their own achievements against what they perceive in you. Or perhaps you're the sibling who seems always to have it together, thus allowing another sibling to remain in a state of perpetual rebellion. When the mirror is taken away, when you step back, these individuals are left grappling with a form of identity crisis. They might blame you, accusing you of selfishness or emotional abandonment, but beneath that anger lies a more profound disorientation. Who am I without the reflection you provided? And that question can be frightening, because it points to the reality that many of us never truly learn to see ourselves clearly. We rely on others to show us a curated version of who we are or who we could be. If there is one thing human beings are skilled at, it's constructing elaborate illusions and narratives to maintain a sense of emotional comfort. We tell ourselves stories about how our relationships work, how indispensable we are, or how intimately we are tied to the well-being of those around us. Sometimes these stories are benign, helping us hold families and friendships together. Other times, they become suffocating illusions that mask deeper truths. When you decide to withdraw, when you choose silence or distance over constant interaction, you effectively shatter these illusions for both yourself and the people around you. Suddenly, you are no longer playing the role assigned to you in someone else's story. The illusions that hinged on your unwavering participation collapse, leaving bare, unfiltered truths exposed. This exposure can trigger a wide range of emotions: anger, sadness, confusion, resentment, guilt, and even shame. Paradoxically, individuals who initially demanded your closeness may now feel betrayed by your decision to create space, interpreting your step back as a critique of their needs or character. They may lash out, attempting to pull you back into the old dynamic, or they may retreat into their own emotional fortress, blaming you for the instability they feel. But emotional turmoil isn't limited to the person you stepped away from. It affects you as well. After all, if you've been consistently fulfilling a certain role in someone's life, stepping away can unearth your own psychological baggage. Perhaps you derived self-worth from being their advisor or caretaker. Maybe you enjoyed being seen as indispensable. With the illusions shattered, you might suddenly feel aimless or uncertain. Who are you without the roles others have given you? This turmoil reveals how deeply we're emotionally intertwined. Stepping away isn't simply taking a break. It shifts an ongoing psychological dance, exposing truths that might be uncomfortable. In many relationships, there's an undercurrent of reliance. Sometimes it's mutual, sometimes it's one-sided. You might have a friend who always calls you after a breakup, leaning on your ear and empathy to stabilize their world. Maybe it's a romantic partner who relies on you for emotional reassurance daily. These situations can be fulfilling when there's reciprocity, but they become suffocating when one person carries the burden of emotional support while the other remains chronically dependent. This is where the concept of the crutch comes into play. When someone uses you as a crutch, they're depending on you to prop up parts of themselves they either refuse to confront or haven't yet learned to manage. It might be insecurity, fear of abandonment, or a sense of inadequacy. By always being available, by always fixing or comforting, you inadvertently reinforce their reliance. It's a twisted dance, but one that feels deceptively comfortable for both parties. They have support, and you feel needed. But let's imagine you decide, finally, that you can no longer sustain this role. You see the exhaustion in your own reflection, or you realize that you've neglected your own needs for too long. So you step away. At first, this might feel like relief, a sudden unclenching of old obligations. Yet, for the other person, it's a jolt that can manifest as anger or desperation. They might call you selfish or accuse you of abandoning them. And a small part of you might feel guilty, questioning whether you made the right choice. Still, stepping away from a crutch dynamic is often the only way for genuine growth to occur. By removing yourself as the perpetual safety net, you force the other individual to find their own footing. They may stumble, yes, but stumbling is sometimes the first step to learning how to walk unassisted. It's a painful process, but it's also a profoundly human one, paving the way for more balanced, authentic connections. What truly unsettles people about your absence? It might appear, on the surface, that it's simply the lack of your presence. After all, they might miss your laughter, your warmth, or your guidance. But if you dig deeper, you'll find that what people really fear is the void your absence creates. Voids, by their nature, demand to be filled. They function like empty vessels that highlight what was once there and is no longer available. It's not just you that's missing. It's the network of emotional ties, the roles you played, the expectations you fulfilled. When you vacate a role, be it peacekeeper, cheerleader, motivator, or confidant, the person left behind must confront an empty seat that once held all their projections. Sometimes they realize they can't fill that vacancy alone, and that realization can be terrifying. Rather than confront the fear, they may lash out or withdraw. They might harbor anger directed at you, but in reality, it's anger born of not wanting to face their own dependence or vulnerability. For you, observing these reactions can stir a sense of empathy, pity, or even resentment. Maybe you never realized how essential your presence was to them, or maybe you did and felt overburdened by it. Either way, the void you leave behind often reveals more about the people you step away from than it does about you. It strips away their veneer of self-sufficiency, exposing the underlying tension that was always there. Voids are uncomfortable precisely because they reveal necessity. They shine a spotlight on the parts of our emotional makeup that depend on others. So when you create that void by stepping away, you're indirectly initiating a form of enforced self-reflection in those around you, a reflection many might prefer to avoid. By now, you've likely sensed a pattern. The decision to distance yourself, whether it's a simple pause in communication or a more definitive withdrawal, acts as a catalyst, unearthing dimensions of human interaction that typically remain hidden. Most of us navigate life using a framework of polite exchanges, shared laughs, and an unspoken agreement not to dig too deeply into the psychological underpinnings of our relationships. But stepping away changes that equation. It upsets the social contracts that say, we will maintain our expected roles without questioning them. Once you break that covenant, everything that was lying dormant below the surface, dependency, fear, anger, insecurity, rushes upward in a swirl of confusion. This is where the real journey begins, the point at which we move beyond polite conversation and into the raw territory of the human psyche. For some, this journey is too unsettling. They'd rather patch up the cracks with quick fixes, an apologetic text, a half-hearted reunion, or a vague promise that things will be different. But for others, maybe you sense an opportunity for profound growth, for clarity about who you are and what you want from the connections in your life. That clarity can only come from examining the deeper layers, from asking the tough questions. Why do certain people react so strongly to my distance? What roles have I been unconsciously playing? Do I truly want to continue playing them? This is the messy, fascinating terrain we're about to enter. It's neither comfortable nor straightforward, yet the insights gleaned can be transformative, reshaping how you see yourself and how you choose to engage, or not engage, with others moving forward. It's astonishing how quickly people can reinterpret your identity once you step away. Almost immediately, a flurry of new narratives emerges. Some might paint you as a misunderstood hero who needed to take time for self-care. Others might label you as the villain who callously abandoned them in their time of need. These revised stories aren't truly about you, though. They're about the internal needs and coping mechanisms of the storytellers themselves. When faced with unexplained or unwanted absences, humans instinctively look for explanations. We ask, why did they leave? Was it something I did? Were they never who I thought they were? We rummage through memories, searching for signs or signals that might piece together a coherent explanation for the abrupt shift. This mental exercise is equal parts detective work and emotional self-preservation. No one likes confronting the raw truth that they may have been overly dependent, or that the relationship had become toxic or lopsided. So the mind reaches for a narrative that best preserves the sense of self. If a friend needs to see themselves as wholly good and blameless, they might demonize you to justify your departure. They left because they're selfish, and they always have been. In another instance, if a different friend idolized you, they might romanticize your silence as an act of spiritual or moral superiority, a noble quest you've undertaken. These divergent narratives can be amusing or heartbreaking, or both, when you observe them from the outside. You might stumble upon a mutual friend who relays a story about you that's almost unrecognizable. But this phenomenon underscores a simple truth. Your departure is not just an event in someone else's life. It's a psychological pivot point that pushes them to reconstruct their entire understanding of who you are and why you mattered. And that reconstruction says far more about them than it does about you. The emotional range people exhibit in response to your absence is staggering. Some will slip into sorrow, lamenting the loss of your closeness, or the fact that they no longer feel your support. They might oscillate between melancholy and regret, wishing they had done more to keep you around, or convince themselves they should have seen it coming. Others will become defensive or combative, conjuring justifications for why your leaving doesn't matter, or why you were never that important to begin with. And then there are those who quietly accept it, perhaps stoically, or even with a hint of relief. Not every reaction to absence is negative. Sometimes, two people drifting apart can bring a sense of peace or closure, particularly if the relationship was strained or toxic. For these individuals, your departure might serve as confirmation that your connection had run its course. Over time, these emotions can shift. An initial wave of anger might soften into melancholic reflection. Regret can transform into acceptance, or acceptance can turn into newfound resentment if they dwell too heavily on perceived slights. This emotional flux is often compounded by other factors in a person's life: stress at work, changes in family dynamics, or personal growth experiences. Watching these varying responses from a distance can be illuminating. You start to see how each person's reaction is filtered through their unique lens, shaped by their personality, history, and core fears. This vantage point can foster empathy or detachment, depending on your own emotional reserves and reasons for stepping away. But one thing becomes clear: your absence is like a pebble dropped into a still pond. The ripples it creates expand well beyond the center, touching every aspect of that person's emotional landscape. Every relational dynamic has an unwritten script. Maybe you're the helper, the peacekeeper, the comic relief, or the level-headed leader. Others come to expect you to fulfill that script in every situation. But what happens when you suddenly decide that you will no longer read from that script? People often experience your departure or silence as a loss of control. They were accustomed to a predictable pattern. I call, they answer. I talk, they listen. I cry, they console. Breaking that pattern can elicit panic because it undermines the comfort of the known. Even if the old dynamic was fraught with tension or dependence, it was at least familiar. And let's not forget your own sense of control in all this. By choosing to exit a role, you are asserting agency in a space where you might have previously felt trapped or taken for granted. This can feel liberating, but also scary. Am I allowed to rewrite my own role? You might wonder. And if you do, will anyone accept the new version of you, or will they reject you entirely? The truth is, rewriting your personal script is a double-edged sword. It can provoke others to reconsider how they see you and the role you play, prompting some to adapt and grow alongside you. But it can also lead to conflict or estrangement with those who resist the change, who insist you remain the person you once were for their convenience. This tension between their desire for a stable script and your desire for authenticity lies at the heart of why absence and distance can shake people so profoundly. People don't always realize that a single act, like stepping away, can ignite an entire chain reaction. But it does. By removing yourself from a familiar dynamic, you create space where every person involved must reevaluate their behaviors and emotional coping strategies. Some may discover hidden strengths. Perhaps they learn to self-soothe or seek professional help for issues they once unloaded on you. Others might spiral into a search for a new crutch to replace you. In that sense, your departure is a powerful catalyst, an event that accelerates change in multiple directions. It's tempting to assume that only negative fallout occurs, but that's not necessarily true. Many positive transformations can blossom from the seeds of absence. Maybe a friend you've supported for years finally develops the confidence to stand on their own, or a family member who always relied on you for conflict resolution steps up and learns to navigate disagreements independently. For you, the word catalyst applies just as strongly. By stepping away, you're also catalyzing change in your own life. No longer weighed down by the emotional or mental burdens you once carried, you have more energy and mental real estate to invest in your personal growth. You might pick up a new hobby, rediscover an old passion, or simply relish the peace of not being perpetually on call. And yes, that can feel selfish, but not all self-care is selfish in a negative sense. Sometimes it's a necessary realignment. Catalysts spark reactions, and reactions reshape the entire system. The real question is, are you prepared for the shifts that your absence will create? Because once you introduce that catalyst, there's no going back to the status quo. Denial is one of the first shields people raise against discomfort. When you step away, someone might tell themselves, they're just busy. They'll come back. They always do. This denial serves as a mental cushion against the shock of the new reality. But when days turn into weeks, or weeks into months, that cushion deflates, and a sharper sense of doubt sets in. Did I push them away? Were they never as close as I thought? Have I lost something irreplaceable? These questions, swirling in an individual's mind, can induce a mini identity crisis. They start to question how they view themselves in the context of the relationship. A friend who thought of themselves as always supportive and kind might wonder if they were inadvertently demanding or manipulative. A partner who believed you were soulmates might fret over whether they idealized you or missed glaring red flags. Meanwhile, you may face your own wave of doubt. Removing yourself from the relationship might initially seem righteous or necessary, but as the silence stretches on, you might wonder if you made a mistake, if you acted hastily or harshly. That's the silent echo of second-guessing that can creep in once you're past the initial emotional rush of stepping away. The identity crisis goes both ways. For them, it's about reconciling the image they had of you and themselves with the reality that you can live without them. For you, it's coming to terms with the reality that you can stand apart and define yourself in a new light, even if that means leaving behind certain roles you once found comfort or pride in. Both parties may, in the long run, emerge stronger and more self-aware from this crisis. Yet, the in-between state, where denial and doubt wrestle for control, can be one of the most emotionally turbulent phases of the entire process. When time passes without a resolution, no grand reconciliation, no dramatic confrontation, something fascinating happens in the human mind: myth-making. People start weaving stories about who you really are, or were, and why you left. These myths can become so powerful that they overshadow the real experiences you once shared. One friend might say, "They were always so introspective, maybe they just needed spiritual solitude," and romanticize your departure as a quest for higher truth. Another might sneer and declare, "They think they're better than everyone," reducing your choice to perceived arrogance or snobbery. These narratives are stories people tell themselves to manage their lingering emotional tensions, to fill in the gaps that your departure created. Interestingly, these myths are rarely static. As more time passes, the stories can shift. If someone initially demonized you in the heat of the moment, they might eventually soften their view, especially if they find evidence that contradicts their original negative narrative. Conversely, a person who once idealized you may reframe the relationship upon learning new information or re-evaluating old memories. These poetic reconstructions are deeply human. We all do it, even if subconsciously, because living with ambiguity, "Why did they leave? What was my role in it?" is uncomfortable. Myths tie up loose ends, offering neat explanations or moral lessons, even if those explanations are incomplete or skewed. Meanwhile, you stand at a distance, possibly baffled if you hear rumors or second-hand accounts of these stories. You might wonder how your real, everyday self got transmuted into these archetypal figures: the saintly seeker, the unfeeling antagonist, the misunderstood introvert. The truth is, your actual motives and experiences often matter far less than how others need to frame your departure in order to cope or heal, or remain in denial. Human beings are creatures of habit, even in the realm of relationships. We derive comfort from familiar patterns, daily messages, routine meetups, or the stable knowledge that a certain person is always there. When those patterns break, chaos ensues. This chaos isn't always dramatic. It can be subtle, like a slow unraveling that throws people off balance bit by bit. In close-knit families, for instance, if you've always been the mediator between two arguing siblings, your stepping away removes the buffer. Disputes that you once deftly managed might flare up, forcing them to find new ways to communicate, or simply leaving them to thrash in unresolved tension. In friendships, your absence can shift social circles. Where once you were the linchpin, now there's no central figure holding the group together. Friends might drift apart, form new subgroups, or resent each other for your departure. This disruption often leads to disillusionment. People realize their routines relied heavily on your presence. Yet, from another perspective, this breakdown creates an opportunity to form more genuine connections. Of course, you might feel pangs of guilt or regret, witnessing the chaos from afar, especially if you see relationships faltering, tensions flaring, or individuals struggling in ways you know you could have helped prevent. Yet, you also recognize that maintaining those old patterns came at a personal cost. Stepping away is an affirmation of your right to prioritize your own mental and emotional well-being, even if it shakes the foundations of others' worlds. In the thick of all the emotional turmoil, guilt, resentment, and myth-making, it's easy to lose sight of a critical potential outcome: growth. For you, stepping away can be a clarifying event. You may discover that your identity does not hinge on being the caretaker, the joker, the wise confidant, or whatever role you once filled. You find space to develop new skills, explore personal passions, or simply enjoy the peace of not constantly managing someone else's needs. On the other side, those left behind also have a unique opportunity, though it often doesn't feel like a gift at first. They are pushed to confront their reliance on you, to grapple with the emotional or practical gaps your absence reveals. Such confrontation can lead to positive changes. Someone might sign up for therapy, start journaling, or finally learn how to navigate conflicts on their own. Another might realize they were neglecting their own sense of identity by focusing too heavily on you. In that sense, your departure can spark self-discovery. What's particularly interesting is how these growth journeys can later intersect again. It's not uncommon to see friendships or family bonds rekindle in more balanced forms after both parties have had time to evolve independently. Whether that happens or not, the key point is that mutual growth is possible, even if it's not guaranteed. So yes, stepping away can feel dramatic, even tragic in some contexts. But it's also a chance to break cycles of codependence or unspoken resentments. The space you create can act as a crucible, forging stronger, more self-aware individuals. Ironically, by not being there, you sometimes help others, and yourself, more than you ever could by staying. If you find yourself in the position of having stepped away, or contemplating it, you may experience a mix of liberation and longing. Liberating, because you finally exhaled the burdens you were carrying. Longing, because certain comforts or emotional currents that once filled your life might now be gone. This mix is normal. It signifies you're in a transition, stepping from an old version of yourself into something not yet fully formed. Reflection becomes a critical tool here. Ask yourself, which relationships truly nourish me and which drain me? How did I contribute to the dynamics I'm now stepping away from? What boundaries or values do I need to uphold going forward? This reflective process can be lonely, especially if the relationships you stepped away from formed your primary social circle. In that loneliness, however, lies the opportunity for a new type of community, one built around shared insights, deeper connections, or even solitary pursuits that feed your spirit in ways you never considered. You might join new groups aligned with your interests, or form friendships with people who respect the boundaries you've newly set. Let's not forget that your actions can also inspire those around you, even if it's initially met with confusion or criticism. In a world hyper-focused on constant engagement, the decision to prioritize your mental and emotional health can be quietly revolutionary. It can set an example that it's okay to pause, to say no, or to step away when it's necessary. Ultimately, the silence you introduce by stepping away or limiting contact doesn't have to be a permanent state of isolation. It can be a recalibration, a conscious choice to engage with people and situations more mindfully when you do return. And that mindful engagement often fosters a far healthier, more genuine sense of community. Here we stand at the culmination of our deep dive into what it means to step away. We've examined the emotional shockwaves it sends through your relationships, the identity crises it can spark, the myth-making that follows, and the seeds of growth it plants for everyone involved. Stepping away, we see now, is rarely a simple act of negligence or coldness. It can be an intentional, even courageous move toward greater authenticity and self-respect, for you, and paradoxically, for those who have relied on you. Now, I'd like to extend a personal invitation to you. If you felt a resonance with these words, if you see parallels in your life, if you've been harboring that quiet urge to take a step back for your own well-being, or if you're simply fascinated by the emotional labyrinth we've traversed, let's continue this exploration together. If you want to journey further into these depths, unpacking the hidden mechanisms that drive human interactions, self-discovery, and emotional freedom, then subscribe to this channel.